do this activity in a face-to-face workshop, I typically get mostly C's and a few B's. And I'm going to go through the three of them and share with you my logic for why I think C is the best answer. If we look at A, list the mistakes writers frequently make, that's a pretty low-level cognitive activity. I can open up my textbook, I start listing mistakes, no particular order, no prioritization, and the reporting conversation is basically going to have students throwing items out and I'm writing them down. Not much conversation. If we look at B, we're getting better. We're having the students use the course content. They're applying the course content to solve this problem where they identify active and passive voice. But if we look at C, where they identify somewhere the passive voice is used and those loaded words used most appropriately, if you think about that reporting conversation, the difference between B and C, in B, the reporting conversation might be, I think sentence 4 is a good example of the active voice. Oh, I think sentence 6. We might both go, yeah, I could see that. Very, not a rich conversation. Contrast that to the conversation that will likely happen in C, where I think the passive voice was used most appropriately in sentence 4. And I'll go, I think it was in sentence 6. Suddenly the conversation is, why do you think 6 is more appropriate than 4? And they're going to get into the details and subtlety of that decision making. The other way to look at these three is, if I can't list the mistakes that writers make, unlikely that I'll be able to identify examples, so that B is better than A. And if you look at C, if I'm going to identify the passive voice, likely I'll be able to also identify the active voice, and so that B encompasses, or C encompasses B, and B encompasses A. So C is probably, or my opinion, is the best answer. Here's another activity that I came upon a couple of months ago, and the context here is the students have been talking about groundwater and contamination. And there starts with a news story, and the news story is a local doctor is concerned about there's some kind of poisoning, turns out to be arsenic, in the community. They're not sure where it's coming from. So what the community has done is they've gone out and they've drilled some wells and done some water testing, and they've also interviewed a bunch of the residents. We give to the students the well data and the interviews. They work through the interviews and the well data, and they start to map out in their teams where they think this contamination might be coming from. Now, if they read the interviews very, very carefully, they'll realize the contamination is coming from the cemetery. If they read the interviews not so carefully, they'll almost always identify the factory B as the source. You get in a very rich conversation about, well, why do you think it's factory B? And they'll say, well, an interview of Bill, who lives over here, he said, that it started when that factory appeared. So they can discuss why they made their decisions. It turns out that the contamination is in fact coming from the cemetery due to some arsenic and bombing fluids they used in the Civil War. And if there's subtle clues to that in the interviews themselves. Pretty amazing activity. Typically takes about 45 minutes. I think the amazing piece of this is for grade 7 students. Really powerful stuff. One of the things when you start to teach your students how to problem solve is they get very good at it. We consistently underestimate how well the students are going to do on these activities once we get them problem solving. So here's an example from a 4th year mechanical engineering course. It's an aerodynamics course, and in this assignment the students were asked to position a pitot tube on this airfoil. And a pitot tube is a little hollow L-shaped tube that sticks up from the wing and measures airspeed. So the students have to worry about how the air is moving around the airfoil, and they also have to worry about how strong that little tube is. Interesting thing is all the instructor wanted from the students was an XY coordinate for where they put the tube. There's about 3 hours of reasonably ugly math behind this. But that XY coordinate, they came to class, they gave the instructor the XY coordinates, he typed them into Excel, displays this graphic. Conversation has to ensue after this when you think about it. If you look at E below the airfoil there, the assignment actually said putting the pitot tube on the upper surface of the wing. So you have to ask Group E where they think the upper surface is. The other thing is they may have some compelling reasons why they decided to put it on the lower surface, and it'd be interesting to have them share that with the other students. So if we look at the ones on the upper surface, I mean, it's very interesting. A, B, and F have clustered kind of at the middle of the wing, G at the front, D high over the wing. They're going to get into an interesting conversation about why they picked their specific location, what assumptions they made, what pieces of data they thought were more important. And it's these sort of contrasts and comparability that makes that conversation so rich. The instructor in this instance actually took this a little further, and he had the students report the results on a one-page document in 18-point font, and they weren't allowed to use numbers or equations. They had to give a qualitative description of their thinking that led to them picking a particular location. So Larry Michelson did, in his 2002 book, presented some interesting data on whether students perceived a large class as helping or hurting their learning. And this is pretty remarkable stuff. 49% of them thought that the large class setting actually helped their learning. Very, very powerful stuff. Now, large class in this instance is around 120 students in his context. So just revisit this diagram one more time. So the 2-week modules have this consistent structure of this one class readiness assurance process at the beginning, and then multiple classes of these team activities.